very excited to welcome Judy. She was in here earlier as a participant and now as our keynote speaker. Judith Schwartz is going to be giving her keynote address on a global tour of Earth repair. Judith is an author who tells stories to illuminate ecological concepts and cultural nuance. Her articles and essays appear in numerous publications, and her books include Cows Save the Planet, Water in Plain Sight, and the Reindeer Chronicles. Judith is joining us from her home in southern Vermont. And welcome, Judith. We're so thrilled to have you here.
Thank you so much. It's great to see everyone. Sounds like a great day that everyone has had. I was thrilled to stop in at Doug Tallamy's talk. I've just taken a permaculture design course, so I've got grand plans for everything. And now I've got all these, now I know more about caterpillars and why they matter and all the plants that will bring them here to feed the birds and to turn into butterflies and all of that. So anyway, great to be here. Let me, okay, I know there's a rhythm to this. Okay, let me get this going. Is that shared? Oops.
Not yet.
Okay, all right. Then that means that I did that exactly the backwards way, okay? So once I do this, it'll be all good. Aha, okay.
Got it.
Is it full size now?
Not yet. Just you need to just click your slideshow.
Okay. Why does this not get easier?
There you go.
Okay,
Great.
Here we are.
Yep.
I am going to begin with a story. Neil Spackman was a college student when 9/11 happened, and having befriended a Muslim goldsmith while doing missionary work in Guatemala after high school, wanted to understand Islamic culture and the politics of the Middle East. So he became a student of Arabic. When the Al Baida Project, an effort to improve living conditions for impoverished Bedouin in Saudi Arabia, got underway, Neil's language ability got him hired. Here, in a valley between the cities of Mecca and Jeddah, the land had deteriorated to the point where the Bedouin could no longer live as they had for thousands of years, moving with their herds of animals and sleeping in goat hair tents. Instead, they were living in cinder block houses with no viable livelihoods. Neil proposed an ecological component to the project and fast-tracked a course of study in permaculture, including consulting with Jeff Lawton, who some of you may have heard of, as he famously created a food forest in the Jordanian desert. Neil and his team put in swales and various simple earthworks to capture water in the rare instances of rain. And after every rainfall, they rushed to plant. When I said his team, that sounds like it might be like, people, kind of coming in from outside, but this was a team of local people, of Bedouins that he was working with, and coming to know these people became one of the most powerful parts of the experience for Neil. So after every rainfall, they rushed to plant. By holding on to the rain with these earthworks, they had a bank of water to draw on to keep the trees and other plants alive, making sure never to overdraw their water account. They kept up this routine, harvesting water and planting for several years, often with a year or more between rainfalls. Then in 2016, the project ran out of funds and they needed to stop the irrigation. Oh well, Neil said, thinking that the permaculture ideal is to create a self-sustaining ecological system anyway, And so this was a chance to see if they succeeded. 2 years and a scant 5 centimeters of rain later, they found that 80% of the trees survived. In 2019, Neil went back and shared these images. Aha. Okay. Wait a second, that's not in order. Okay. There, that's what I wanted to see. So I think, is that the before? Right. This is the before and after. This was taken after a rainfall. I'm not sure what year it was, but they had just put in these rocks to kind of hold the moisture, and the grass had come up because there was a recent rain. But here, the rain is really part of the system. Oops. Okay, so you get a sense of what Neil was able to do, and he is over there now. So I am really, really excited to see what it looks like even another year later. A few years ago, I started collecting stories like this. News about the environment was relentlessly upsetting, and yet I knew that there were people out there doing incredible things, working with nature rather than fighting her. The assumption that many people have is that landscapes are static, that they stay the same unless, of course, something bad happens to them and they get worse. And that's when we always hear the news about the environment. But I understood that from having written a book about soil and a book about water, that ecosystems are by nature dynamic, and that the balance of various processes and species is always shifting. And from my reporting, particularly about the use of grazing animals as vehicles for large-scale land restoration, I knew that the way that we manage land can revive degraded landscapes, even dramatically. I also believed it important to share these stories for several reasons. One is to help us envision a positive future. For how can people imagine once damaged ecosystems flourishing unless we know that it's possible? Another reason is that each example of earth repair embodies valuable how-to knowledge that can be applied in other places. And finally, it invites people into the process of restoring ecologies because we see that this can happen everywhere and at all scales. In short, while we've been trained to believe that solving societal problems is best left to experts, earth repair is a participatory sport. And I love that Doug Tallamy made that point, that anyone with 1/10 of an acre, anyone who lives near a park or can be in touch with what their town is doing can make a difference. One story that launched me, okay, I don't know why that's there, that happens to be Spain, but I'm going to be wanting to share something else. So let me see what I can do. Okay, let me share the screen for this. Okay. One story that launched me on this path is the restoration of the Loess Plateau in China. Can you see the video? That isn't quite.
No.
Okay, let me see what's going on there. Okay, I think it's here now. Okay. So this is the Loess Plateau. This is where agriculture in China began around the same time as it did in the Fertile Crescent, and was long the breadbasket of China. However, hundreds of years of poor livestock management and farming on hillsides led to massive erosion, with the mineral-rich but friable soil blowing away and silting up the Yellow River, causing all sorts of problems. In the early 1990s, weary of dealing with continuous flooding and poverty in the region, the Chinese government embarked on a huge watershed rehabilitation project with help from the World Bank and other entities. I mean, this was huge. They had consulted with hydrologists, geologists, biologists, chemists, economists. I think there were a lot of economists involved, actually. I mentioned that restoration is a participatory sport. And here, local people from literally thousands of villages were hired to do the work of moving soil, creating terraces, planting trees. Admittedly, this was a top-down effort, but ultimately the region's people reaped the benefit as some 2 million people were lifted from poverty. People who had been living in caves now had proper homes, and many dependent on food aid were able not only to grow what they needed, but now have extra to sell. So here is an 8-second version of what happened. Here, bear with me. Okay, sorry about this. So now I'm going back to this. Share screen. Really sorry about this. As I'm saying, I don't know why it just never gets easier. Okay, anyway, so that's, can you see the Los Plateau image now? Okay, great. Yeah, so what we saw was over 14 years. And, you know, this is just another way of looking at it, but I like using that little video because you can just, you know, because it collapses time. We know a lot about this transformation thanks to John D. Liu, a Chinese-American filmmaker who documented the project for the World Bank and whose time lapse we just saw. Here's John. The experience changed John's life. So after he saw what happened and followed it and interviewed people and spent a lot of time in the region, his response was, since we know that it is possible to restore large-scale degraded ecosystem.
Once there was plenty of space, but the population is rapidly increasing and people are consuming more and more.
Sorry, that was from something else. Here, let me go back to this. Really sorry about that. There's John. So, you know, once we know that we can restore large-scale damaged ecosystems, how can this not be the priority for what we do in our lives and do everything we can to make this happen? So John, back then in the mid-90s, delved into research on ecological restoration and found that, surprise, there was a ton of research about what happens when things go wrong and very little on what happens when things go right, basically on function, ecological function. Yet, as he says, it's a lot more fun to address function rather than dysfunction. In a few minutes, I will come back to John and tell you a little bit more about what he's doing now. And yet, a focus on function opens up new ways to understand our environment and how to restore the Earth's wounded places. Let's take, for example, the question, what is a desert? Now, we all think that we know what a desert is, that maybe there is some threshold beyond which, a threshold of how much rainfall determines whether something is a desert or not a desert. But let's see how Neil Spackman defines a desert. He says that a desert is a place where when it rains, it floods. And for all its aridity, in Western Saudi Arabia at Al Baida, it does flood. And these floods can be damaging. So the water comes, it's between mountains. And when the rain comes and falls from the mountains, it's tremendously damaging and really overwhelms the place because the land can't do anything with that water. Neil is saying that once it no longer floods when it rains, when the water soaks in and supports life, rather than running off and causing more erosion, this land will cease to be a desert. And what we're seeing is that in Al Baida, this is starting to become the case. So you saw the first picture, that when it rains, there's bare soil. And so much of that water will just flood off. So the first picture did have some earthworks in there. But now look at, the rainfall is being captured by the land. So this land is moving away from being a desert. Granted, his project is only about 100 acres, but that's really important to know that this is possible. The process of ecosystems advancing in function and complexity, what we saw in the last second or two of John Liu's film, is called succession. Simpler pioneer organisms build the conditions for higher order species to thrive. And so the whole system functions at a higher state. The heart of ecological restoration is to advance succession. In other words, to become nature's ally on the ground and help a living community move in a positive direction. In that way is more midwifery than makeover. According to John, the way to advance succession and by extension to restore an ecosystem involves three basic trends: increasing biodiversity, increasing soil organic matter, and increasing biomass. This is something that we can apply anywhere, in a local park, on a farm, in someone's front or backyard. No effort is too small. I have a friend, Monica Ibichachi, who teaches permaculture to children in New York City. She works on road medians and the ring of soil around city trees. She and the children will mulch around the trees on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, building organic matter, and the kids are so excited to see the critters that find their way into the soil. These three, biodiversity, soil organic matter, and biomass, support each other as the area gains function in every setting. There's a practice called Centrotropic Agroforestry that can be seen as applied succession. Here, the focus is on creating the conditions for each plant to thrive, which in turn creates the conditions for the next order of organisms to thrive. The idea is to create the antithesis of entropy. So, centrapy, a synthesized word, a made-up word, to concentrate matter and energy. It at once emulates and accelerates nature. It was developed by Ernst Gutsch, a Swiss farmer who moved to Brazil 30 years ago and transformed 300 acres that had been deforested and overgrazed into a lush, densely vegetated area, producing 3 times the cocoa that is typical for the area, whereas previously the land was deemed inappropriate for cocoa production. While at COP21 in Paris, I saw the brief film Life in Centrapy, here's Ernst Gutsch, and was blown away, as was everyone in the contingent that we were all sitting. Anyway, it was really quite a magical moment. So the organization Regeneration International, they rented out a whole floor of a kind of a backpackers hostel. And then in the downstairs, we had meetings and we saw films. And I remember that I had wicked jet lag. I had only just arrived, and a couple of guys from Brazil showed up and just, you know, popped this film into someone's hand. And we watched this 15-minute film, Life in Centrapy. And it was, anyway, it was really quite extraordinary to see. And this is now being applied in many parts of the world, including in Australia and Hawaii. We saw this being implemented in Maui last year. So there I am taking notes. This is at a place called Happy Maui. Happy stands for something like, oh my gosh, I don't even want to try to say, but there I am rapidly taking notes on all of the plants that are in this system and which plants will give way to the higher order canopy plants while maintaining a biodiverse community of plants. So what they did was they put in a variety of early successional plants like pineapple and banana. Anyway, I just have to pause. I mean, they talk about, just we get so much banana here. I mean, what an incredible environment this is. It was such a gift to be there. So what happens is that the banana and pineapple and everything else generates a lot of biomass, which is then pruned to help and put on the ground to help set the stage for the higher order plants like coffee and cocoa. They do a similar approach at another place on Maui called Hokonui. Oh, anyway, that's just a snapshot of a pineapple plant. And here's Hokonui, where the forester, Koa Hewa, he calls this polyforestry or Polynesian agroforestry, and draws from indigenous Hawaiian knowledge. So what he's doing here is he is reforesting this land. So this is I forget exactly how much land this entire project is, but they are combining many things. They're combining holistic management, grazing management, because this area of Maui actually it was a big kind of cowboy area. There were huge ranches. And so that draws on some of the culture there, and they can work with the grassland areas while having these agroforestry projects integrated into the landscape. And then there are also some residences that they're working with. So I guess it's kind of an agri-hood. I'm not sure how far they're getting with the residences, but what Koa, by the way, is, I mean, he is named for a native tree in Hawaii, that he is working quarter acre by quarter acre. And I don't know if this is exactly the plot that we were looking at, but there was a plot that looked really established. And he said that that was 14 months old. So it's really keeping the system going through applying succession and keeping the dynamic of the faster growing plants and working with the biomass, and that creates more organic matter and it allows for greater biodiversity. So again, the biomass, biodiversity, and soil organic matter all work in synergy. Beyond the basics of these three, the restoration approach for a given place, the biodiversity, biomass, and soil organic matter, the restoration for any given place depends on context. On the Los Plateau, one important strategy was removing livestock, with goats and sheep wandering around, essentially unmanaged. Plants did not have a chance to regrow. However, as many of you know, in many instances, grazing animals are a tool for regenerating landscapes. One place where I witnessed this was at Rancho Las Damas in the state of Chihuahua in Mexico. Okay, they're just some beautiful bulls. I went to Chihuahua because I learned of an interesting project. Ranchers there were working with bird conservation organizations to create a habitat for endangered migratory grassland birds. So these are grassland birds that summer in the middle of the US. And what the bird conservation organizations had been focusing on the summer habitat and wondering why their numbers were dwindling. In fact, these birds spend some 7 months in Mexico, many of these birds in the Chihuahuan desert grasslands, and these grasslands were disappearing for many reasons. One being poor grazing management, another being that because so many of the ranches were going out of business, were going under, Mennonite farmers were buying huge areas of land, plowing up the grasslands and doing intensive high input agriculture. So anyway, I was very intrigued because I did not think of birds conservationists and ranchers as natural allies, as such groups often clash. But the bird people saw that under holistic management, which creates the optimal extent and rhythm of animal impact, with cattle moving as they would in nature when being pursued by predators, the land was vibrant and full of birds. The land, in fact, was, as someone with the American Bird Conservatory said to me, very birdy. The initial focus was biodiversity, but enhanced biomass and soil organic matter, of course, followed. One thing that I like about this project is how it is expanding in the region. When I visited, there was a vast tract of land adjacent to Las Damas Ranch that looked horrible, mostly bare ground with a little bit of mesquite kind of sprinkled here and there. I said to my host, Alejandro Carrillo, doesn't this make you crazy? Isn't there some way to convince the owner of this land to change what he's doing? Because it looks so obvious to anyone who looks at it. Unlike me, Alejandro has a lot of patience. He answered me with one of his favorite sayings, that people would rather fail conventionally than succeed in doing something new. Don't worry, he said, he'll decide to change. 3 years later, the owner came to Alejandro and said, I want my land to look like your land. And when we talk about his land, we're talking about 100,000 acres. That can support a lot of birds and butterflies and mule deers and pronghorn sheep. So it's really, really exciting what's happening in this area. And again, these were stories that I did my best to bring about, but that the possibility of improving landscapes really hasn't entered our collective consciousness. I'm going to shift gears a little bit, and I would like to talk about earth repair as an important strategy for climate change. Now, when we hear the story of climate, it is often told through charts and graphs, heroes and villains, silver bullets, and the like. Oh, that's just showing a really tiny snapshot of how holistic management, the animal's hooves create little crevices that hold water, and that the perennial grasses then are able to start. So this is just a snapshot of what's going on as the land shifts from bare soil, degraded soil, to soil that is able to support perennial plants. Okay, backtracking. When we hear the story of climate, it's often about charts and graphs, but it's essential that we recognize that climate is also about this. This is an image of a cloud forest in the Sierra Gorda in Querétaro State in Mexico. I share this to point out that we collectively have thus far neglected the role of functioning ecosystems in climate regulation. It is important to bring this into climate discussions because here we have tremendous agency. I mean, when you think about it, we have been talking about addressing climate change as if we don't have to touch anything. And yet the dynamics that create our climate are all around us. So here in Mexico, this cloud forest is creating, it is holding cool, okay? The water is rapidly cycling. It is holding moisture, and that moisture allows for more plants that are adapted to that particular environment to grow. And those plants are transpiring, and that transpiration is a cooling mechanism, and that vapor, that moisture is holding, it is creating a feeling of coolness that wouldn't be the same in other areas that don't have the same altitude and same community of plants. But plants are managing heat through their transpiration and the condensation. The cloud cover is also holding that heat in abeyance as well. So it is a part of climate regulation. In its most basic sense, the story of climate is the story of what happens to solar energy when it meets the ground. What determines the fate of solar energy, whether it is incorporated by life forms or becomes sensible heat, is the culmination of natural cycles, of the carbon, water, energy, and nutrient cycles. And these cycles are driven by the activity and processes of animals and plants, by life. In short, by biodiversity within the context of biomass and soil organic matter. Here in the Mexican cloud forest, as I was explaining, water is cycled within the area, supporting plants and wildlife, while soil rich in organic matter holds carbon, water, and nutrients. Were these majestic trees cut down, the ground would dry out, the soil erode, and the beautiful birds, jaguar, and orchids that dwell here would be without a home. Climate-wise, it would become a negative spiral. Fortunately, the Sierra Gorda group has been able to preserve this land and help ensure that people in the mountain villages there have the means to sustain themselves that don't involve cutting down trees. This is a pattern that I have seen throughout the world, that people find themselves in a situation where in order to take part in the global economy, they have no choice but to degrade the environment on which they depend. This was the case in Saudi Arabia, where the Bedouin, unable to move with their herds, cut down trees to sell for firewood in the city while buying feed for their animals for Australia. I mean, that made no sense, but the loss of ecological function had put them in that dilemma. So an important goal in ecosystem restoration is to create and ensure livelihoods. With the Albeida project, Neil and his team focused on trees that had economic applications. And here in Mexico, the Sierra Gorda group helped villagers create businesses as artisans, and they developed a flavor trail of casual eateries based on traditional cuisine. I was lucky enough to spend some time in the Sierra Gorda with everyone there, and with the people who lead the organization. And one of the things that they did to help people support themselves was this flavor trail. And it was amazing. I mean, we'd go to these little places, and sometimes the main ingredient of the food, like little kind of croquettes, little patties, were flower petals from flowers picked outside in the back of the little restaurant. So anyway, I was really charmed by that. But it's really powerful, because people are left without options. And when you work with people, you don't just say, your landscape is important to us as conservationists. You need to become partners with people and see what they need and help them flourish as well. The point that I'm making is this: the state of our landscapes are reflected in the state of our climate. Healthy ecosystems are central to climate regulation and therefore to climate resilience. We know how to restore ecosystem function in a variety of landscapes, from deserts to grasslands to the humid tropics. Therefore, ecosystem restoration is a key strategy for dealing with climate change from both adaptation and mitigation standpoints. In other words, we have solutions right before us that bear not only on climate, but also on the well-being of communities and people's livelihoods. After filming the Los Plateau project, John Luce struggled to find a way to scale up ecological restoration to ensure that the skills and knowledge needed to harvest water, build terraces, manage livestock, and choose combinations of plants is widely available. At one point, he came up with the idea of camping, of setting up locations throughout the world where people, assuming they were invited to that particular location, would set up tents, take their shovels and machetes, and set out to heal the land. I first heard of this in Paris at COP21, when a group of us met in the back of a Chinese restaurant. And John, it was fabulous. John, of course, speaking in Chinese, ordered for everybody, and he was, having a grand time. Everyone was listening to him, and he was talking all about let's go camping, and saying what we need to do is we need to set up yurts, and we need to go camping. He also liked the term glamping. As it played out, it wasn't quite as, the glam part of camping didn't quite materialize the way perhaps he had envisioned. But, he was really, really onto this. We need to go camping, and we need to learn these skills. We need to share these skills. We need to train people who are then able to train others. So a few months after that, he put up a Facebook post inviting people to join this venture. And, he just kind of put it out there and didn't know what to expect. And within a few weeks, several thousand people had responded. 2 years ago, I went to visit the first ecosystem restoration camp, Camp Altiplano in Spain. That's the kitchen area at Camp Altiplano. And so this is where they broke in the idea, learning as they went. Okay, that's the region of Spain, the Altiplano. That is much greener than it usually is, but we were there in November, and there happened to have been a lot of rain, actually. I think you could see, Jo, that's her name. Jo is wearing a raincoat, and it's pretty chilly. And here we are. There's me, my son, Rachel, and Jonathan, who I write about in my book, and they're in the kind of headquarters. One bit of learning that they had there is that it's really beneficial if you have some infrastructure in place when you start setting up shop to restore the landscape. Because what happened was they had no infrastructure. There was in La Juncara, there were a few several 100-year-old buildings, and they needed to kind of revamp them, get them into shape. And then that was a couple of miles from where the operation was. Anyway, they learned a lot. And it was hard, but there's a tremendous amount of spirit. And what was so striking to me was the sense of agency that these young people had doing this work, the sense of agency compared to the sense of despair that I often hear from people who are concerned about the climate, but don't feel that they have any way in to make a difference. Also, in compared to the despair that these two people, that Rachel and Jonathan themselves shared with me, that they had had before they got involved in this project. So what's amazing is that while this was the first project, and at the very end of 2018, when I was there, actually exactly not even 2 years ago, because it was the end of November, because we had Thanksgiving there. There were only 2 camps, and now there's about 24, and there are about 20 more coming online. And what they are doing is extraordinary. So, there are camps in Thailand and in Bolivia, and in each place, there's a different focus, and there's a different kind of body of knowledge that they are absorbing and creating and learning from the local communities and sharing their labor with the local communities. And one thing that I find incredibly meaningful is in California, there is a camp that was created as a disaster response camp, Camp Paradise, in the town of Paradise that suffered a devastating fire 2 years ago, which killed many people, I think 80 people, something like that, and displaced thousands, including one of my friends who also, needed to start again, and also saw this not only as a tragedy, but as a learning opportunity. So in Camp Paradise, they're working with the community to see how best to design for resilience to wildfire. And way up north in California, in Camp Hotlum, actually where John Liu was kind of stranded during COVID for several months, they were really, really close to some fires. And so all these camps are trading information, and they're developing networks to work together. And I was on some of the email conversations that were happening about a month ago. And one thing that they were working on was getting people on site immediately to help deal with the toxic ash, because when there's a rain that comes after a fire, all that ash is going to move into the waterways. And the federal and state responders just don't have that on their agenda. So I think that was really powerful, that the camp network is also creating a support network and a network of people that can just get active immediately. So that's really powerful. And I'm going to end just by noting that, and this is something I don't know whether many of you know, that the United Nations has declared the next decade, beginning 2021, as the decade on ecosystem restoration. And stay tuned, because many of us are working on communication strategies. I'm working with the communications manager to set up a network of journalists, not only professional journalists, but to build resources for citizen journalists, youth journalists, citizen scientists, to communicate metrics on ecosystem restoration. About an hour just before I got onto this call, I was speaking with a colleague of mine in California, who's also a great communicator, who is collating metrics of like soil health. There's so much information right now that at this moment, the people have been developing the sets of information that relate to soil health, biomass, biodiversity, and restoration, that they've been working on that, but now just are beginning to talk to each other so that all of this data, all of these stories can be shared and brought forth as ecological restoration becomes more part of our understanding of what our task is and what our opportunity is as we move forward into this challenging time. So thank you. That is what I have to share.
Judy, that was really amazing. Thank you. Thank you so very much. Did you want to just say a word about your book, Reindeer Chronicles? I don't know if you have a picture there on your site. I should have thought to pull one up.
It's on my website, and I'd love to share it. It's also a Chelsea Green book.
Yeah.
And basically, as I was doing my reporting, I kept learning about more and more amazing projects, and just was struck by the lack of just that it wasn't part of the picture. So often when I write my books, I think about what is missing. And I kept being struck with what is missing is the potential to restore our ecosystems and what that means for communities. I mean, we know about food security and peace and just everything about how we live in the world can be shifted in a positive direction through the process of ecological restoration, to say nothing about meaningful work for people. I mean, one thing that John Liu has always talked about is that ecological restoration also gives people the opportunity to take part in the improvement of their own landscapes. I mean, we always hear about climate refugees. People don't want to leave their homes. They leave because they can no longer grow food in those places. And so then you get huge populations of people at the frayed edges of megacities that have no work. But yet there is work to be done. See, that's the other disconnect, that there are places where there aren't enough people to do the restoration work that needs to be done through regenerative agriculture, through building water harvesting techniques, through planting trees in an ecological way, through centrotropic agriculture and different forms of agroforestry. So, while we, on the one hand, we say, oh, the situation is terrible in such and such a landscape, and oh no, there's not enough work for young people. Well, let's bring those two together so that people have pride in their work and can do the work that needs to be done. So anyway, the Reindeer Chronicles is essentially a global tour of earth repair. And I include some of these stories and other stories. And compared to my other books, I would say that I deal more with the human side of things because it's necessary. And I know many of you have been thinking along these lines for a long time. But in truth, as a journalist, my focus had always been on information, that if only people had the information to make these changes, they would do it. And then I began to, the obvious began to dawn on me that, oh, these are people challenges. So Then I learned about a consensus model that I found very powerful. I spent a weekend at a workshop in New Mexico where I watched a community going from conflict, and I'm talking about, this is the Wild West. This is sabotage and gunfire and, craziness, to working together and being committed to work together to improve their land. So it was quite extraordinary. So anyway, went to a lot of cool places.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Judy. And just to remind everyone that Judy will be back again tomorrow morning as part of a discussion. She'll be talking about her book on water. We also have Peter Bain and Greg Watson joining us tomorrow morning. And Judy will also be doing a breakout at 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, so you can save your questions about water and about earth repair for then. Judy, thank you so much for joining us, especially in a dark November evening. We really, really appreciated having you here. And thanks all for an amazing day. I look forward to people seeing everyone tomorrow morning. I hope you get a good night's rest, and we will see you anon. Good night. Thank you.
Okay. Good night, everybody. See you all tomorrow.